Welcome, beloved, into the presence of Jesus, the one who calls you not with accusation, but with compassion, not with force, but with love that patiently waits and gently invites. You are not here by accident, and these words are not meant to frighten you, but to draw you closer to truth, healing, and life. Jesus welcomes you as you are, aware of your restlessness, your questions, your grief, and even your resistance. He sees the seasons you have outgrown, the weight you have carried, and the moments when you delayed listening because change felt costly. Still, he does not turn away. His welcome is not based on perfection, but on willingness. He invites you to lay down illusions, release what no longer gives life, and step into honesty without fear of rejection. In him, warnings are not threats but signs of care. Boundaries are not cages but protection, and truth is not condemnation but freedom. Jesus welcomes you into a space where you are allowed to feel, to question, to grieve, and to grow. He does not rush you, yet he calls you forward. Here, you are not asked to perform or pretend, only to be sincere. In his presence, what breaks can heal, what ends can transform, and what feels uncertain can become the beginning of something deeply real and alive. Listen beyond sound, beyond language, beyond the restless noise of your thoughts, and hear with that quiet inner place where truth settles only after resistance grows tired, because what is being spoken now is not meant to accuse or intimidate, but to reach you before numbness becomes permanent, and before denial hardens into identity. This voice does not rise from anger or impatience, but from love that refuses to disappear simply because it has been overlooked. Love that continues to speak even when ignored. Love that warns not to dominate, but to preserve. What is approaching cannot be reduced to weather, politics, or singular events, nor can it be confined to a map or a moment in history, for it is a convergence shaped by long-standing choices, quiet compromises, delayed honesty, and truth postponed for comfort, a reckoning not imposed from outside but emerging from within what has been cultivated over time. Many will experience its weight not because destruction is desired, but because growth denied becomes pressure, and pressure, when ignored, must eventually find release. You may wonder why this awareness has settled so close to you, why it presses against your breath and follows you into stillness. And it is not because you are better than others or free of fault, but because you are willing to feel, willing to notice, willing to remain sensitive in a world that trains itself to go numb. Even when fear convinces you that your sensitivity is a flaw, it is precisely this openness that allows you to detect misalignment, to feel sorrow that extends beyond your personal story, to carry questions that refuse shallow answers. And these are not burdens assigned by mistake, but invitations extended with intention. You have delayed listening at times, promising yourself you would respond later, change when circumstances were easier, awaken when the cost felt lower, but awakening never arrives in a season of comfort, only in the season that presents itself, and this season has arrived. What unfolds next does not begin with catastrophe but with clarity, beginning where illusion collapses, where avoidance can no longer hold shape, where hearts must decide whether they will soften into truth or harden into defense. Some will name what follows chaos, others destiny, others misfortune, but it is consequence braided with mercy, for even now the door remains open. Even now choice remains available. Love does not withdraw when warning is issued. It remains, though the way it is experienced changes, because light does not endlessly chase a soul that continually turns away, but stands firm, steady, allowing the cost of turning to become visible, not as punishment, but as respect for freedom. Love without choice is control, and control has never been the language spoken here. You have sensed this shift long before words were given to it, felt it as restlessness, as a quiet knowing that something was ending even without outward evidence. Noticed how former distractions no longer satisfied, how conversations that once filled time now felt hollow, how familiar coping mechanisms lost their comfort, not because you are broken or ungrateful, but because you are outgrowing what once fit. Growth often feels like grief before it feels like expansion, and many will resist what comes next not because it is evil, but because it requires honesty, because it strips away what was built on fear, convenience, pride, or borrowed belief, exposing foundations that were never examined. For some, this exposure will feel devastating. For others, it will feel like a long-awaited exhale, because the same force that floods one ground nourishes another, and the difference is never the rain but the soil. You are not tasked with rescuing the world or carrying its weight. That responsibility was never placed upon you. Your calling is quieter and deeper, to tend your own heart with integrity, to become a place where truth can rest without disguise, because a life lived in alignment becomes an invitation without words, light shining without argument, transforming what is ready and revealing what must retreat. You may fear you are unprepared, measuring yourself against imagined ideals and concluding you fall short, but readiness has never been perfection. It has always been willingness, the courage to admit uncertainty, the humility to be corrected, the strength to change direction, the patience to forgive yourself while learning. You are not asked to become someone else, only to remove the armor and be honest about who you already are. The days ahead will test where trust is anchored, as structures you assumed stable begin to shift, voices you relied upon contradict themselves, and certainties dissolve into questions. And when this happens, panic will tempt you to reclaim control, but panic blinds rather than protects. Instead, presence is required, the willingness to breathe, to observe, to allow discernment to rise slowly rather than forcing conclusions in darkness. Not every loud declaration carries truth. Not every quiet one signals weakness, and you will feel pulled either toward isolation or toward emotional hardness. But both extremes must be resisted, for you were not made to disappear nor to close yourself off. Boundaries are not walls built from resentment, but agreements made with compassion, clear yeses and clean no's chosen with care. Understand this deeply. Truth is not found only in certainty but in sincerity, and when you choose honesty over appearance, you are closer to alignment than when you perform righteousness without love. When you admit fear and still move gently forward, when you listen patiently to those who disagree, when you practice quiet devotion instead of loud display, depth is formed where noise once lived. Loneliness may visit you in this awareness, not as punishment, but as passage, for not every soul awakens simultaneously, and your task is not to rush others nor slow yourself to blend in, but to remain rooted where you stand. Grief you carry for lost possibilities, for paths untaken, for versions of yourself released in order to survive, is not to be silenced or bypassed with forced optimism, for tears are as welcome as praise, and honesty never offends what is real. As what has been hidden comes to light, remember that breaking does not always signal loss. Sometimes it signals freedom, the shattering of cages mistaken for shelter. Truth may arrive suddenly, like lightning, startling and bright, revealing the landscape more clearly than gentle daylight ever did. And when this happens, anchor yourself in what endures: kindness that does not depend on agreement, patience that outlasts confusion, humility that keeps learning, courage that remains gentle. You will face moments where fear or compassion compete, where urgency tempts you away from wisdom, where reaction seeks to replace response, and even a single pause, a single breath, can change the direction of an entire moment. Conscious action carries power, panic never will, and guidance often arrives not as instruction but as discomfort that nudges you away from misalignment, or as unexpected peace in the midst of uncertainty, both of which are conversations meant to be recognized. Failure is never final unless learning is refused, hesitation never betrayal unless it becomes avoidance, and patience stretches further than you imagine, though moments still matter because they shape you. Do not freeze in fear of choosing incorrectly. Choose with care and humility, trusting that adjustment remains possible. When noise increases and opinions fracture, return to simplicity, asking not who is right but what leads toward love, what expands your ability to see others as human rather than reduce them to threats. Love does not require agreement with everything. It requires refusal to dehumanize. You are not required to carry everyone, nor to rescue those who refuse openness, but you are invited to offer presence rather than control, truth without coercion, kindness without self-erasure. What is unfolding is not meant to terrify but to deepen, for what cannot be sustained indefinitely must eventually change, and the end of pretending is not the end of hope but the beginning of something truer. Warnings are not weapons. They are invitations offered before pain becomes the only teacher left, spoken not for the sake of authority but because foresight carries responsibility. Silence in the face of foreseeable harm would not be love, and urgency does not signal cruelty but remaining possibility. Warnings are layered with patience, repeated gently before they grow clearer, placed as signs along the path not to confuse but to guide, and when ignored they do not disappear but grow louder, not to overwhelm but to cut through distraction. Warning is evidence of care, not rejection, for nothing abandoned is warned. Silence is far more dangerous than correction, because silence often means a path has been chosen so firmly that redirection would be rejected. Truth remains true whether acknowledged or not, just as gravity operates regardless of belief, and to ignore warning is not to defy a voice but to step out of alignment with what sustains life itself. Small compromises grow roots, habits shape identity, pride disguises itself as confidence, fear masquerades as wisdom, delay pretends to be patience, and warnings interrupt these illusions not to steal comfort but to preserve future wholeness. Comfort is not synonymous with safety, ease not equal to peace, and some paths feel smooth precisely because they slope downward. Warnings disrupt short-term relief in favor of long-term truth, and their discomfort is mercy. Repeated dismissal dulls discernment, not as punishment but as consequence, for sensitivity unused weakens over time. Boundaries spoken as warnings protect not only individuals but all connected to them, for no decision exists in isolation, and love speaks before suffering multiplies. Correction precedes consequence, invitation precedes collapse, counsel precedes loss, and what is often labeled judgment is simply the moment where warnings have been exhausted and reality proceeds without interference. Patience creates space between action and outcome, not as approval but opportunity, and mistaking patience for permission is a costly misunderstanding. To dismiss warning is to reject relationship, to trust limited vision over eternal perspective, isolating oneself where deception thrives. Yet warning refines character, cultivating teachability, resilience, and grounded wisdom. Subtle warnings arrive first as unease, conscience, remembered truth, blocked paths, withdrawn peace, and louder ones follow only when subtlety is ignored. Ignoring warning risks more than comfort or pride. It risks integrity, clarity, peace, and connection, losses that accumulate quietly until recovery demands far more than early adjustment ever would have. Warnings push toward life rather than mere survival, urging release of what suffocates even when familiar, teaching flexibility that bends instead of breaking. For strength is responsiveness to truth, not stubborn resistance. Responsibility accompanies warning because knowledge invites choice, and dignity lies in being treated as capable of wisdom. Perfection is never demanded in response to warning, only sincerity, movement, acknowledgement, and willingness to turn even slightly away from harm. Warnings often mark thresholds, signaling endings and beginnings, and those who heed them pass through with humility while those who ignore them are carried through by force of circumstance, reaching similar destinations through vastly different experiences. These words are spoken not against you but for you, because your life is precious, your future worth protecting, and truth ignored does not vanish. Every warning is an opportunity to choose life while choice remains yours, to listen while skies are still clear, to adjust before damage demands repair, and to trust that what speaks now seeks not to control your path, but to guard your becoming. Gracious and eternal God, I come before you in stillness and humility, asking not just with my lips, but with the deepest part of my being that longs for truth and alignment, and I ask you to help me hear beyond noise, beyond fear, beyond distraction, into that quiet place where your wisdom settles and transforms. I thank you that you speak not to accuse, not to threaten, not to control, but because your love refuses to abandon even when it is overlooked, delayed, or misunderstood. I acknowledge, Lord, that what you are revealing is not bound to a single event, moment, or circumstance, but is the unfolding of consequences shaped by choices, habits, compromises, and postponed honesty, and yet even in this, mercy is present. Teach me not to resist growth when it becomes uncomfortable, for I understand now that growth resisted becomes pressure, and pressure ignored demands release. I confess that there have been times when I promised myself I would listen later, change later, become more honest later, when life felt safer or easier, but I now understand that awakening does not wait for comfort. It arrives when it must. Help me not to harden my heart when illusions fall apart, but to soften, to remain teachable, to choose humility over defense. Thank you for respecting my freedom, for never forcing love, and for standing firm rather than chasing me endlessly, allowing me to see the cost of turning away, not as punishment, but as truth. Lord, I bring before you my restlessness, my grief, my sense that something old is ending, even when I cannot fully name it. I confess that what once comforted me no longer satisfies, that distractions feel hollow, and that old ways of coping no longer bring peace. Help me trust that this is not brokenness, but growth, not ingratitude, but transformation. Give me courage to release what was never meant to anchor me, and wisdom to see that not everything breaking is being lost, but that some things are breaking because they were cages. As the days ahead test my trust, when structures I relied upon shift, when voices I trusted contradict themselves, when certainty dissolves into questions, keep me from panic. Anchor me in presence. Teach me to breathe, to observe, to listen deeply, to allow discernment to rise gently rather than forcing conclusions in fear. Guard me from extremes, neither retreating into isolation nor hardening my heart for protection, but help me build boundaries with compassion, not bitterness, choosing clean no's and intentional yeses rooted in love. Remind me, Lord, that you are found not only in certainty but in sincerity, that honesty draws me closer to you than performance ever could. When loneliness visits me in this season of awareness, remind me that it is a passage, not a punishment, and help me remain rooted without rushing others or dimming myself to blend in. I bring you my grief for paths not taken, for versions of myself I had to release to survive, for losses I never fully named, and I ask you to meet me there, knowing that my tears do not offend you and that nothing honest ever distances me from you. As truth reveals itself suddenly and sharply at times, help me anchor in what endures kindness, patience, humility, courage, and to pause before choosing fear over compassion, reaction over response, urgency over wisdom. Teach me to recognize your guidance, whether it comes as discomfort steering me away from misalignment, or as unexpected peace in uncertainty, and help me trust that even when I fail, learning remains possible, and even when I hesitate, grace remains present. Lord, when noise grows louder and opinions fracture, return me to simplicity. Help me ask not who is right, but what leads toward love, what expands my capacity to see others as human. Free me from the burden of rescuing everyone, and instead teach me to offer presence without control, truth without coercion, kindness without self-erasure. I receive your warnings not as condemnation, but as evidence of care, knowing that silence would be far more dangerous. Help me not to mistake your patience for permission, nor comfort for safety, nor ease for peace. Sharpen my discernment so I do not ignore subtle warnings, the unease, the withdrawn peace, the blocked path, the quiet conviction, before they grow louder through circumstance. I ask for humility to respond early, for courage to adjust, for wisdom to turn even slightly away from harm when you make truth clear. Thank you for treating me with dignity, for trusting me with choice, for calling me into responsibility not to burden me but to mature me. I confess that I do not desire mere survival. I desire life, true life rooted in alignment with what sustains me. Strengthen me to bend before I break, to remain responsive rather than stubborn, to choose truth even when it disrupts comfort. I place my future in your hands, trusting that every warning is an opportunity to choose life, that every moment of clarity is an act of love, and that you speak because my life is precious, my becoming matters, and my story is not finished. I surrender my resistance, my fear, my need to control, and I ask you to steady me, guide me, and keep me aligned with what is true, enduring, and life-giving. I receive your mercy, your wisdom, and your protection, and I choose to listen, to respond, and to walk forward with humility and trust. Amen.